They called her the last resort, but she was exactly what he had been waiting for without knowing it. Sarah Elizabeth Murphy pressed her worn gloves against the train window, watching the endless expanse of golden prairie grass bend and sway beneath the October wind. The other passengers had made their opinions clear with sideways glances and whispered conversations that weren't quite quiet enough. Third choice. Replacement bride. The woman nobody else wanted. But as the locomotive carried her toward a future she couldn't yet imagine, Sarah felt something stirring in her chest that had nothing to do with their cruel assessments and everything to do with the wide, open sky that seemed to promise second chances. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Your comment helps our community grow stronger. Thanks, and let's get back to the story. The train's whistle cut through the afternoon air like a mournful song, and Sarah gathered her courage along with her single carpet bag. She had read Thomas Harrison's letter so many times the paper had grown soft at the creases. Practical words from a practical man seeking a practical arrangement. His first choice had married a banker in Denver. His second choice had decided Montana was too far from civilization, which left Sarah, 24 years old and running out of options in a world that considered unmarried women past their prime to be burdens rather than blessings. The platform in Cedar Ridge was little more than weathered planks and a painted sign, but it represented everything Sarah had never dared hope for. A fresh start. A place where nobody knew about the whispers that had followed her through the streets of St. Louis, where being the daughter of a failed shopkeeper and having opinions that didn't fit into parlor conversation had marked her as unsuitable for respectable marriage. She stepped down from the train car, her worn boots touching Montana soil for the first time, and breathed in air so clean and sharp it made her chest ache. The scent of sage and distant snow carried promises she couldn't yet name, but her body recognized them anyway. This was the smell of possibility. Thomas Harrison was easy to spot among the handful of people gathered at the station. Tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that spoke of honest work and eyes the color of storm clouds. He approached with the careful politeness of a man who had learned not to expect too much from life, removing his hat as he came near. Miss Murphy. His voice carried the weight of Montana winters and the careful reserve of someone who had been disappointed before. I'm Tom Harrison. Mr. Harrison. Sarah's voice was steadier than she felt. Thank you for meeting me. They stood there for a moment, two people taking the measure of each other while the train puffed and wheezed behind them like an impatient beast. Sarah saw the way his gaze took in her plain brown dress, her carefully mended gloves, the single bag that held everything she owned. She wondered what conclusions he was drawing, whether he was already regretting his decision to send for her after the other women had found better options. But when she looked up into his face, she saw something that surprised her. Not disappointment, but a kind of cautious hope that mirrored her own. Here was a man who understood what it meant to be someone's last choice, and maybe that was exactly what they both needed. The wagon's just over here, Tom said, reaching for her bag with a gentleness that spoke well of his character. It's about an hour's ride to the ranch. I hope you don't mind the dust. Sarah almost smiled at that. After 3 days on a train filled with cigar smoke and the complaints of fellow passengers, a little honest dust seemed like a luxury. I don't mind at all. The wagon was sturdy rather than elegant, pulled by 2 horses whose ears swiveled toward her with friendly curiosity. Tom helped her up to the seat with careful hands, and she noticed the way he made sure she was settled before taking up the reins. Small kindnesses that spoke louder than grand gestures ever could. As they pulled away from the station, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the window of the general store. A woman with brown hair that refused to stay properly pinned, green eyes that held too much thought for fashion, and a face that would never be called beautiful but might someday be called dear. She had spent years believing that not being beautiful was the same as being worthless, but sitting beside this quiet man who had chosen her when no one else would, she began to wonder if maybe there were different ways to measure a person's value. The countryside opened up around them like a revelation. Rolling hills painted in gold and amber, scattered with cattle that moved like brown and black brushstrokes against the canvas of grass. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks touched with early snow that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in brilliant flashes. Sarah had never seen anything so beautiful or so vast, and she felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. It's not much like St. Louis, Tom said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty as if he worried she might find it lacking. No, Sarah agreed, drinking in the sight of a red-tailed hawk riding the wind currents above them. It's better. She felt rather than saw his surprise, and when she glanced over, she caught the beginning of what might have been a smile touching the corners of his mouth. It transformed his whole face, making him look younger and less guarded, and Sarah felt her heart do something complicated in response. Most folks think it's too empty out here, Tom said, but there was less worry in his voice now. Too quiet. Sometimes quiet is exactly what a person needs. Sarah's words came out softer than she intended, carrying more truth than she had meant to reveal. But something about the endless sky and the gentle rhythm of the horses has made her feel safe enough to be honest. They rode in comfortable quiet for a while, and Sarah found herself studying her soon-to-be husband from the corner of her eye. He had strong hands on the reins, patient with the horses, and when a rabbit darted across their path, she noticed how he automatically slowed to let it pass safely. These were the kinds of details that told her more about his character than any letter could have conveyed. The Harrison Ranch appeared gradually, first as a wisp of smoke against the sky, then as the outline of buildings nestled in a valley between gentle hills. A two-story house with a wide porch, a barn that looked well-maintained, corrals that held a handful of good horses, and everywhere the signs of a working operation run by someone who took pride in doing things right. Home, Tom said simply, but Sarah heard the deep satisfaction in his voice, the way a man sounds when he talks about something he has built with his own hands and sweat. As they approached the house, Sarah noticed details that spoke of a woman's absence. Practical curtains rather than pretty ones, a garden that held only vegetables and herbs with no flowers to soften the edges, a porch that was clean but bare of the small touches that made a house feel welcoming rather than just functional. I should tell you, Tom said as he helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering a moment longer than necessary at her waist. I'm not much for conversation. My late wife, she used to say I was better with animals than people. Sarah looked up into his face, seeing the vulnerability he was trying to hide behind practical words. Sometimes animals are easier, she said gently. They don't judge a person for being quiet. Something shifted in his expression then, a recognition passing between them like a shared secret. They were both people who had been judged and found wanting by a world that valued the wrong things, and maybe that was the beginning of understanding. The inside of the house was as practical as its exterior suggested, but Sarah saw potential in the clean lines and generous windows. The kitchen was spacious and well-organized, with a cast-iron stove that looked like it could handle anything she might ask of it. The sitting room held furniture that was sturdy rather than fashionable, and everywhere there was evidence of a man living alone, making do but not quite thriving. I know it's not fancy, Tom started, but Sarah was already moving toward the kitchen window, drawn by the sight of the overgrown herb garden just beyond the glass. May I? She asked, gesturing toward the back door. Tom nodded, following her outside where the afternoon sun slanted golden across a plot of land that had once been someone's pride. Sarah knelt beside the tangled mess of plants, her fingers finding familiar shapes among the weeds. Rosemary and thyme, sage and oregano, even some medicinal herbs that most people wouldn't recognize. But Sarah's mother had been a healer before she became a shopkeeper's wife, and she had passed her knowledge on to her daughter along with her gentle hands. Your wife knew plants, Sarah said softly, not looking up from the forgotten garden. She did. Tom's voice carried old grief, carefully contained. Said herbs were God's medicine, growing right where we needed them. Sarah's fingers found a struggling plant of comfort, its leaves yellowed but still alive underneath the choking weeds. She was right about that. She looked up at Tom then, seeing something in his face that made her chest tight with unexpected emotion. Would it be all right if I worked on this? It seemed a shame to let all her knowledge go to waste. For a moment, Tom didn't answer, and Sarah worried she had overstepped some invisible boundary. But then he knelt beside her in the dirt, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he began pulling weeds from around a struggling mint plant. She would have liked that, he said finally. She would have liked you. They worked together as the sun sank lower in the sky, not talking much, but moving in a kind of harmony that surprised them both. Sarah's hands seemed to know instinctively which plants could be saved and which were beyond help, and Tom followed her lead, learning the difference between weeds and medicine under her patient guidance. When they finally stood, brushing dirt from their clothes, the herb garden looked like it might have hope again. And standing there in the golden light with soil under her fingernails and this quiet man beside her, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt useful, valued. Home. I should show you your room, Tom said, but there was reluctance in his voice, as if he wasn't quite ready for this easy partnership to end. The room he led her to was clean and simply furnished, with a window that looked out over the herb garden and the rolling hills beyond. Sarah set her carpetbag on the bed and turned to find Tom watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Are you sorry? She asked quietly. That the others said no, I mean. Are you sorry you ended up with your third choice? Tom was quiet for so long that Sarah began to regret asking. But when he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that made her heart flutter like a caged bird. I'm beginning to think, he said slowly, that maybe they weren't my first choice at all. Maybe they were just the ones I thought I was supposed to want. That evening, Sarah prepared their first meal together using vegetables from the garden and herbs she had salvaged from the tangled plot outside. Nothing fancy, just beef stew seasoned with rosemary and thyme, biscuits that rose golden and perfect in the reliable oven, and coffee strong enough to chase away the chill that crept in with darkness. Tom ate with the appreciation of a man who had been making do with his own cooking for too long, but it was the way he watched her move around the kitchen that made Sarah's cheeks warm, not with judgment or criticism, but with something that looked almost like wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe his luck. You're different than I expected, he said finally, pushing back from the table with a satisfied sigh. Different how? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Better, Tom said simply. Quieter, but not in a weak way. In a peaceful way. Sarah had been called many things in her life, but peaceful was not one of them. In St. Louis, her quiet nature had been seen as evidence of her lack of proper social skills. Her tendency to notice details others missed had been dismissed as odd rather than observant. But here, in this kitchen filled with the scent of herbs and honest cooking, her differences felt like strengths rather than shortcomings. Over the following days, Sarah settled into the rhythm of ranch life with surprising ease. She woke before dawn to prepare breakfast, packed Tom's lunch with the care of someone who understood that small kindnesses mattered, and spent her days bringing order and beauty to a house that had been merely functional for too long. But it was in the evenings that something deeper began to develop between them. After the dishes were cleared and the animals tended, they would sit on the porch watching the sun paint the sky in impossible colors, and slowly, carefully, they began to share the stories that had shaped them. Tom told her about his first wife, Mary, who had been everything the town expected a rancher's wife to be, social and proper, and well-suited to organizing church socials and ladies' auxiliary meetings. He spoke of her with love, but also with a kind of distant sadness, as if he were describing someone he had cared for but never quite understood. She wanted to change things, he said one evening, his voice carrying into the gathering darkness. Make the house fancier, host dinner parties for the neighbors. She couldn't understand why I preferred the quiet. Sarah, who had spent years feeling inadequate because she preferred books to parties and gardens to gossip, felt something ease in her chest. Some people need noise to feel alive, she said gently. Others need silence to hear themselves think. Which are you? Tom asked, and there was something in his voice that suggested her answer mattered more than polite conversation. I'm the silence kind, Sarah admitted. Always have been. It used to worry my mother, how little I talked. She thought something was wrong with me. Nothing wrong with listening more than talking, Tom said, and in the darkness, Sarah heard approval rather than criticism. World's got plenty of noise already. As October melted into November, Sarah found herself growing into the space Tom's quiet acceptance provided. Her herb garden flourished under her careful attention, providing not just seasoning for their meals but medicine for the small injuries and ailments that were part of ranch life. When Tom cut his hand on a piece of wire, she cleaned and dressed the wound with a comfort poultice that healed faster and cleaner than anything the town doctor might have provided. Where did you learn that? Tom asked, watching her work with professional competence. My mother, Sarah explained, her hands steady as she wrapped his palm with clean cloth. She was a healer before she married my father. Said most people had forgotten that God put medicine in the ground right alongside the food, but that didn't mean it wasn't there. Tom flexed his bandaged hand experimentally, surprised by how much better it felt already. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was, Sarah said softly. She died when I was 18. After that, my father tried to marry me off to anyone who would have me, but... She trailed off, not wanting to sound bitter about the string of rejections that had eventually led her here. But they were all fools, Tom finished quietly, and the certainty in his voice made Sarah's throat tight with unexpected emotion. The first snow came early that year, dusting the hills with white that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the morning sun. Sarah woke to find the world transformed outside her window, and she dressed quickly, eager to see how the ranch looked dressed in winter's finery. She found Tom in the barn, tending to a cow that was having difficulty calving. His shirt sleeves were rolled up despite the cold, and there was a tension in his shoulders that spoke of genuine concern for the struggling animal. Can I help? Sarah asked, not bothering to worry about propriety when there was clearly a life at stake. Tom glanced up, surprised to see her in the barn so early, but he nodded toward a basin of warm water. If you could wash your hands and help me turn the calf, I'd be grateful. She's been laboring all night. Sarah had assisted with difficult births before, both human and animal, and she moved with quiet confidence as she helped Tom guide the calf into the world. It was messy, exhausting work, but when the little heifer finally slipped free and took her first shaky breath, Sarah felt the same rush of joy and relief that always came with helping bring new life into the world. Well done, Tom said, his voice rough with fatigue and emotion as they watched the calf struggle to its feet. But Sarah noticed he wasn't looking at the calf. He was looking at her, covered in straw and worse, her hair escaping its pins, her dress certainly ruined, but her eyes bright with the satisfaction of work well done. You're full of surprises, Sarah Murphy, he said softly. Harrison, Sarah corrected without thinking. Sarah Harrison. The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt her cheeks flush as she realized what she had said. They had been married by the circuit preacher 2 weeks ago in a brief, practical ceremony with the mayor's wife as witness, but it had felt more like a business arrangement than a real marriage. Until this moment, when her new name had slipped from her lips as naturally as breathing. Tom's eyes darkened with something that made Sarah's heart skip against her ribs. Sarah Harrison, he repeated, like he was testing how the words felt in his mouth. I like the sound of that. The winter deepened, and with it, the quiet intimacy that was growing between them like something tender and precious. They learned each other's rhythms, the way Tom liked his coffee strong and black, how Sarah hummed old hymns while she worked, the fact that they both preferred the honest tiredness that came from physical labor to the restless energy of idle hands. Sarah had never shared such easy silence with another person. With Tom, she didn't feel the pressure to fill every quiet moment with chatter or worry that her thoughtful nature was being judged as lacking. Instead, she found herself relaxing into a version of herself she had never been allowed to be before, competent and valued and quietly content. The first test of her place in the community came in December, when the minister's wife fell ill with pneumonia just as the church was preparing for its Christmas social. Sarah had been quietly attending services since her arrival, sitting beside Tom in the back pew and trying not to notice the whispered conversations that followed her entrance each Sunday. She's not what I expected, Mrs. Patterson had murmured to her neighbor, loud enough for Sarah to hear. So quiet. Tom needs someone with more presence. But when word spread that Mrs. Davidson was too ill to organize the Christmas gathering, it was Sarah who quietly stepped forward with an offer to help. Not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with the same practical competence she brought to everything else. She organized the other women with gentle efficiency, suggesting rather than demanding, listening more than talking, and somehow managing to coordinate a celebration that was both elegant and welcoming. Her herb garden provided seasonings for the feast that had people asking for recipes, and her quiet attention to detail ensured that nothing was forgotten, from the smallest child's comfort to the oldest widow's dietary restrictions. "I don't know how she does it," Mrs. Patterson admitted to her husband as they watched Sarah make sure everyone had enough to eat. "She doesn't say much, but somehow everything just works better when she's involved." Tom, standing in the corner watching his wife move through the crowd with quiet grace, felt something shift and settle in his chest. This was what he had been missing without knowing it. Not someone who could charm a room with wit and laughter, but someone who could make a room feel like home simply by caring about the people in it. After the social, as they drove home through snow that fell like blessing on the quiet countryside, Tom reached over and took Sarah's gloved hand in his. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Sarah asked, though her fingers tightened around his. "For being exactly who you are," Tom said. "For not trying to be someone else to please people." Sarah looked out at the snow-covered landscape, thinking about all the ways she had tried to change herself over the years to become the kind of woman men wanted to marry and society wanted to accept. But here, with this quiet man who valued her competence over her conversation and her kindness over her appearance, she was learning that maybe she had been enough all along. "I used to think there was something wrong with me," she said softly. "For being so quiet, for preferring plants to parties, for caring more about whether people were comfortable than whether they were impressed." "Nothing wrong with any of that," Tom said firmly. "World needs people who notice when others are hurting, who care more about healing than showing off." As winter gave way to spring, Sarah found herself settling more deeply into her role as Tom's wife and partner. The herb garden exploded into new growth under her careful tending, providing not just seasonings and medicines but also drawing visits from neighbor women who had heard about her skills with healing plants. Mrs. Patterson was the first to arrive, her pride battling with necessity as she knocked on Sarah's door one March morning. "It's my youngest," she said without preamble. "He's got that cough that won't quit, and the doctor in town says there's nothing to be done but wait it out." Sarah invited her in without hesitation, brewing tea from the marshmallow root and coltsfoot she had carefully dried the previous fall. As she prepared the medicine, she listened to Mrs. Patterson's worried chatter with the same quiet attention she gave everything else, asking gentle questions that helped the older woman work through her fears. "You mix this with honey and give him a teaspoon every few hours," Sarah instructed, ladling the fragrant tea into a jar. "And keep a pot of water steaming in his room at night. The moisture will help ease the congestion." Mrs. Patterson took the jar with hands that shook slightly. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing," Sarah said simply. "Just let me know how he's doing." Within a week, Mrs. Patterson was back with a loaf of her famous bread and news that her son was breathing easily again. Word spread quickly through the small community about Sarah Harrison's healing touch, and soon she had a steady stream of visitors seeking remedies for everything from headaches to heartbreak. Tom watched this development with a mixture of pride and wonder. The quiet woman who had arrived as his third choice was becoming the person people turned to when they needed help, and she handled each request with the same gentle competence that had first drawn his attention in the herb garden. But it was the way she cared for him that truly captured his heart. Not with grand romantic gestures, but with 1,000 small kindnesses that made his life richer and more comfortable than he had ever thought possible. Coffee that was always perfect, shirts that were mended before he noticed they needed it, and meals that somehow managed to be both nourishing and delicious without seeming to require any effort on her part. "You spoil me," he told her one evening as she massaged liniment into his sore shoulders after a long day working with the horses. "Good," Sarah replied, her hands strong and sure as they worked out the knots in his muscles. "You deserve to be spoiled." Tom had never thought of himself as deserving much beyond hard work and honest dealing, but under Sarah's care, he began to believe that maybe he was worth the effort she put into making his life better. And more importantly, he began to understand that she needed to feel useful, that caring for others was as natural to her as breathing. The spring roundup brought the ultimate test of their partnership. Sarah insisted on riding out with Tom to help gather the cattle, despite his protest that it was too dangerous for a woman who wasn't used to ranch work. "I can ride," she said calmly, adjusting the stirrups on the gentle mare Tom had provided. "And I can help. You need every hand you can get." She was right about that. 2 of his regular hands had moved on over the winter, and the work of gathering scattered cattle was more than one man could handle alone. But Tom worried about her safety, about what the other ranchers would think of a man who brought his wife to do cowboy work. Those concerns evaporated the first time he saw Sarah work with the cattle. She had an instinct for reading animal behavior that impressed even the experienced hands from neighboring ranches, and her calm presence seemed to settle nervous cattle that might otherwise have scattered at the approach of riders. "Your wife's got a gift," Jake Morrison from the next ranch over told Tom as they watched Sarah gently guide a stubborn steer back toward the herd. Never seen cattle respond to someone like that. Tom felt his chest swell with pride as he watched Sarah work, her quiet confidence evident in every movement. She wasn't trying to prove anything or show off her skills. She was simply doing what needed to be done with the same competent grace she brought to everything else. But the real test came when a sudden spring storm caught them miles from shelter. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, and sleet began falling so hard it was difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. "We need to get these cattle to shelter," Tom shouted over the wind, but his voice was tight with worry as he looked at Sarah, already soaked through and shivering in her saddle. Sarah, however, was studying the landscape with the same focused attention she gave to her herb garden. "There's a box canyon about a mile north of here," she called back. "I noticed it this morning. If we can get them moving in that direction, they'll have natural windbreak." It was a good plan, better than anything Tom had been considering, and he felt another surge of pride in this woman who noticed details others missed and found solutions where others saw only problems. They worked together to turn the herd, Sarah's calm presence keeping the cattle from panicking while Tom and the other hands pushed them towards shelter. By the time they reached the canyon, Sarah was so cold she could barely feel her hands on the reins, but she had never complained, never suggested they abandon the cattle to save themselves. She had simply done what needed to be done with the quiet determination that was becoming familiar to everyone who knew her. That night, huddled around a fire in the lined shack while the storm raged outside, Tom pulled Sarah close against his side and felt something fundamental shift between them. This wasn't just gratitude or companionship anymore. It was love, deep and sure and growing stronger with every shared challenge. "You're remarkable," he murmured against her hair, breathing in the scent of herbs and honest work that always surrounded her. "I'm just me," Sarah replied, but she didn't pull away from his warmth. "That's what makes you remarkable," Tom said, and he meant it more than he had ever meant anything in his life. Summer brought its own rhythms and challenges, but Sarah met them all with the same quiet competence that had carried her through the spring. Her garden flourished beyond anything the ranch had ever seen, providing not just food for their table but surplus to trade in town for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. The other ranch wives began stopping by regularly, drawn by Sarah's reputation as a healer, but staying for the quiet peace that seemed to surround her like a blessing. Her kitchen became an unofficial gathering place where women could speak freely about their worries and fears, knowing they would be met with understanding rather than judgment. "There's something about her," Mrs. Thompson confided to her husband after one such visit. "She doesn't say much, but you feel better just for being around her. Like she sees the good in people even when they can't see it themselves." Tom, overhearing this conversation at the general store, felt his heart swell with pride and something deeper. This was the woman people had dismissed as a last resort, and now she was becoming the heart of their small community simply by being herself. But it was the way she cared for him that continued to amaze Tom. Not just the practical things, though those mattered too, but the way she seemed to understand what he needed before he knew it himself. When he came in exhausted from a difficult day, she would have a hot meal ready and a willingness to listen if he wanted to talk or comfortable silence if he didn't. When he was frustrated with a problem, she would ask quiet questions that helped him work through to a solution without ever making him feel foolish for struggling. "How do you always know?" he asked her one evening as she rubbed liniment into his aching back after a day spent wrestling with stubborn fence posts. "Know what?" Sarah asked, though her hands never paused in their healing work. "What I need. How to help without making me feel helpless." Sarah considered this for a moment, her hands still working their magic on his tired muscles. "I suppose it's because I know what it's like to feel useless," she said finally. "To have people think you're not capable of much. So I try to help in ways that make people feel stronger, not weaker." Tom turned to face her then, capturing her hands in his and looking into her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You have never been useless, Sarah Harrison. Not for one single day since I've known you." The heat in his voice, the certainty, made Sarah's heart flutter against her ribs like a caged bird. Over the months of their marriage, she had grown to care for this quiet man more than she had ever thought possible, but she had been afraid to hope that he might feel the same depth of emotion she did. "Tom," she whispered, his name carrying all the love she had been afraid to voice. "I love you," he said simply, the words falling into the space between them like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would spread outward forever. "Not because you were convenient or available, but because you're you. Because you make everything better just by being part of it." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen and valued for exactly who she was. "I love you too," she whispered back. "More than I ever thought I could love anyone." When Tom kissed her then, it was with the passion of a man who had found something precious he had never expected to have, and Sarah responded with all the depth of feeling she had kept carefully hidden for so long. This was what she had been waiting for without knowing it. Not just acceptance but celebration, not just tolerance but love. The autumn of their first year together brought its own challenges and joys. The harvest was the best the ranch had seen in years, thanks in large part to Sarah's knowledge of companion planting and natural pest control. The root cellar was full, the herb garden had provided enough dried medicine to last through the winter, and there was money in the bank for the first time in Tom's memory. But more than the material success, there was a sense of completeness that neither of them had experienced before. They had found their rhythm as partners, each contributing their strengths to create something stronger than either could have achieved alone. The first anniversary of Sarah's arrival in Cedar Ridge was marked by a community harvest celebration, and as Tom watched his wife move through the crowd of neighbors and friends, he marveled at the transformation he was witnessing. Not in Sarah, who had always been exactly who she was now, but in the community's perception of her. "Best thing that ever happened to this town," old Mr. Fletcher said, nodding toward where Sarah was helping Mrs. Patterson's youngest daughter with a scraped knee. "Don't know how we managed without her. She's something special, all right," Tom agreed, his voice warm with pride and love. "You're a lucky man, Tom Harrison," Mr. Fletcher continued. "Smart of you to see what she was worth when the rest of us were too blind to notice." Tom wanted to correct him, to explain that he hadn't been smart at all, that he had simply been desperate enough to take what others didn't want and fortunate enough to recognize a treasure when it fell into his hands. But instead, he just nodded and watched his wife transform yet another person's day simply by paying attention to their needs. That night, as they sat on their porch watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain air, Sarah leaned against Tom's shoulder with a contentment she had never thought possible. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if those other women had said yes?" she asked quietly. Tom was quiet for so long that Sarah began to worry she had spoiled the peaceful mood with her question. But when he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that made her heart skip. "No," he said simply, "because then I wouldn't have you. And I can't imagine my life without you anymore, Sarah. Can't imagine this ranch, this community, myself, without you in it." Sarah turned to look at him in the starlight, seeing the truth of his words written in every line of his face. "They called me the last resort," she said softly. "Then they were fools," Tom replied firmly. "Because you weren't my last resort, Sarah. You were my salvation." As they sat together in the peaceful darkness, surrounded by the life they had built together, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had spent years believing that being quiet made her inadequate, that preferring healing to socializing made her odd, that not fitting into other people's expectations made her worthless. But here, in this place, with this man who saw her clearly and loved what he saw, she had discovered that all the things that made her different were actually the things that made her valuable. Her quiet nature created space for others to be heard. Her attention to detail meant nothing important was overlooked. Her gentle strength provided exactly the kind of support that helped people heal and grow. She had come to Montana as someone's third choice, a replacement bride nobody else wanted. But she was leaving her old identity behind and becoming something new, someone valued not despite her differences, but because of them. Sarah Harrison was exactly who she was meant to be, and finally, she was in a place where that was not just enough, but everything. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and the wind carried the scent of sage and possibility across the quiet ranch. In the distance, an owl called to its mate, and somewhere in the barn, a horse whickered softly in its sleep. All the sounds of a life well lived, a place well loved, a future full of promise. Tom's arm tightened around her shoulders, and Sarah closed her eyes, breathing in the peace that had become her birthright. She had been called the last resort, the third choice, the woman nobody else wanted. But sitting here in the arms of a man who loved her exactly as she was, surrounded by a community that had learned to value her quiet gifts, she knew the truth that would sustain her through all the years to come. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the quietest hearts, and sometimes the greatest treasures are found not in what the world considers valuable, but in what truly matters. Sarah Elizabeth Harrison had found her place at last, not by changing who she was, but by finding people wise enough to see her worth. And in a world that too often valued the wrong things, that was nothing short of miraculous.